welcome to Can You Just Sit With Me? Where I discuss hope in grief, hope in the hard place, and hope during the challenging times of life. I am your host, Natasha Smith. Thanks so much for joining me today. So today I am super excited to have this conversation with Rachel Lohman. I have her book, and I am just so excited about the conversation that we're going to have. I know it is going to just bless and be so insightful to everyone who will listen. So, hi, Rachel, and welcome to Can
Hi,
You Just Sit With Me? I'm so excited you're here.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me, Natasha.
Yay. So, again, thanks for joining me. Thanks for sitting with me. I want you to just, for those who are not familiar with your story, can you tell us a little bit about your background and just what do you do? Where are you from? Where are
Sure.
you
Yeah.
joining?
Um, right now I live in Southern California, but I grew up, I think, closer to your side of the country. I was born and raised in Indiana, so just, right in the middle of the country.
Yeah.
And then I moved out to Southern California for school and have never gone back. So I've been out here now more than half my life, and I have a background in journalism, but then I went to seminary and entered the pastoral ministry world. That's where I met my husband. And the last 10 or so years, we've been in pastoral ministry in various capacities. We currently lead a bilingual church here in Southern California. Um, but the thing that has been a most recent kind of development was 3 years ago, I started a handmade jewelry line called Hope Again Collective that tells the stories of moms who have gone through pregnancy and infant loss. And I tell their stories behind a pair of earrings that's designed and named after them. So Hope Again Collective has just really been such a special endeavor to be able to walk alongside lost moms like us and provide a safe place for them to tell their stories online. So it's just been a really sweet season. And yeah, what I'm most excited about in this current season is being an author for the first time, which I know we'll dive into there.
Yeah, so amazing. So if you can just tell us a little bit or just tell us your lost story, tell us
Sure.
about it and how it has informed your new book.
Yeah. My entrance into parenthood and motherhood began with loss. And I think because it was at the start of this new chapter of life, I went into that season, excited, also so naive, and nobody in my circle had gone through a loss before, or at least that I was aware of. So I knew that those statistics were out there and that this would be a possibility. But honestly, like so many of us, it never even
Yeah.
crossed my mind. So the grief that came after we lost our first child to miscarriage at about 7.5 weeks of gestation was very blindsiding, um, traumatic, just because it's completely not on your radar. And
Mhm.
it felt like the rug was kind of pulled out from underneath my faith, especially. And I remember in that season right after um, asking questions about God, his sovereignty, and his goodness, and just questioning kind of all the things that had upheld my relationship with God for the very first time. Like I had never looked underneath the surface to be like, okay, well, why do I believe? Is that even biblical? Like,
Right.
am I just thinking like, oh, if I do the right thing, like God will give me what I want? Like probably a little bit more of that than I should have ever have been there.
Mm.
And just in that season, wanting a resource, a book that was deep, that asked the hard theological questions, that gave me space and kind of was a guide for me to process those challenges with God and to walk me back to hope again. And so I knew in that season that there would be a need to create, after that season, there was a need to create a resource
Mm.
that went a little bit deeper. There wasn't a whole lot on the market back then. This was about 6.5 years ago. So that burden never really left me. And in my work with Hope Again Collective, hearing all these other lost mom stories, seeing themes that I experienced echoed in their stories, I just really felt led to write something, write what I wish I had, the companion to help hold my hand as I learned what it meant to trust God and to trust
Mhm.
hope again after loss. So that is kind of the long story,
Yeah.
the personal bend to Miscarried Hope.
Hmm. You have written a beautiful book. I just want to let you know that. Beautiful
Thank
book.
you.
And when you said you wanted something that went deep,
Hmm.
this is what I grasped from your words and from your book. And so I want you to kind of talk about um, just because you make such a crazy, like for me, it was mind blowing connection
Hmm.
between Holy Week and miscarriage and infant loss. Like it just gave me chills just thinking about it again because it's just so theologically deep, and
Hmm.
that's what we need in times of loss. So can you
Yeah,
just, yeah. Hmm.
sure. I'll touch on that. I that actually came to me a little bit later on in the
Mm.
writing process, but when I got that, I was like, "Oh, this all makes sense now." This was the framework
Yeah.
that I needed to work with. Is actually my husband's idea, so I'll give him
Shout
the
out.
credit. As we were processing one night, he's like, I had had a few events from Holy Week in my book, and he was like, "This starts before,
Mm.
just the crucifixion and Silent
Yeah.
Saturday." I had sat in church and, you know, read things about Holy Week for years. And I had never before looked at the emotional experience of Jesus and his disciples during Holy Week until I sat down to write this book. And when I look at the emotions that they experienced and really the traumatic roller coaster that is, starting with
Mhm.
this peak of expectation on Palm Sunday, thinking like, finally, it's
Yeah.
happening, our long awaited Messiah. Like, I mean, for hundreds of years, they had hoped and waited for that moment. And then they thought this was it. This was really going to be what changed history. I mean,
Yeah.
and it did, but
Yeah.
not in the way that they thought.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then after that peak of expectation, just a few days later, Jesus gathers them around and says, "I'm going to be leaving you soon."
Mm.
Just the sheer descent from that peak of excitement, expectation, hope, all of that down to what?
Yeah.
Disbelief, shock. You can't be, you're not, what? Like, just to put myself in their shoes and to feel what they were feeling. And then they walk into the garden scene and watching Jesus plead before the Father that it wouldn't be this way, um, to watching their beloved Messiah and teacher die on the cross and the grief that follows with that, and then the silence of Saturday of
Yeah.
not knowing that resurrection was going to be around the corner. And I think that's something we lose sight of so often is we know what comes
Right.
after Good Friday, we know what comes after Saturday, and we love to skip past that. Um, and thank goodness for the hope that we find in Resurrection Sunday. But all of that to say, when I stepped back and looked at all of these emotions that they walk through in a fairly short period of time, I thought this
Mhm.
is so similar to the emotional experience of a lost mom. From the moment that you're holding that positive pregnancy test and you have that high expectation, that peak
Yes.
of human excitement,
Mm.
then to whenever it is that you get those first signs that something's not as it should be with your pregnancy
Yeah.
and you're in shock. Then when the despair sets in of my baby is dying or has died, and that reality comes crashing in and you don't want to believe that,
Yeah.
followed by often the very long period of grief marked by Silent Saturday. And then we get to the
Mm.
active hope of Resurrection Sunday and learning what it means to live anchored in a hope that death doesn't have the last word in our babies'
Yeah.
stories. And because of Jesus' defeat of death, we have that hope that we'll see them again someday, which can totally change the trajectory of our grief.
Mhm.
Doesn't minimize it, but
Right.
changes it.
Yes. Oh, wow. And you actually call it in your book the stages of hope, right?
Yeah, yeah, those terms I kind of just tossed out. Those are the 5 stages of hope that,
Mhm.
as you read the book, we'll walk through together. And they're not like a perfect progression of stages or
Mm.
anything, but I just find it helpful sometimes to be able to name the season that you're in and the things that you're feeling, to provide clarity for what you're experiencing, but also to be able to frame it as a season and to know that all seasons have their beginning and end points, and you're not going to be in that season forever.
Mhm. I love how you what you just said there, because a lot of times when loss happens, we don't have the language to kind of express. How,
Absolutely.
and so I love that you're making giving language to um, what we may be feeling and experiencing during those times, because that's what I found most helpful too. And I want
Mhm.
to kind of draw the point that you did so much research, the research that you did, because I love research. So
Yes.
so it's so cool that you actually did like was this your own research that you did for your book, and why
Yes.
was it important for you?
Yeah, so I've been collecting women's stories for 3 years now with Hope Again
Wow.
Collective, and I'm studying as I edit the stories, kind of these themes that I see
Mm,
emerging and realizing, okay, this is very common that women are feeling this way initially, that they're wishing for this type of support, that they're having this sort of change relationship with their body, that their faith, if they reference it in their story, is experiencing this sort of change. And so that just made me really curious. I wonder what research would confirm.
mm,
So I put together a survey of questions that kind of touched on those things that I had my observations that I wanted to get confirmed, and also that I knew things that would write from for the book. So topics of shame and faith, change relationships with your body, your
mm,
spouse, those around you, all of that kind of stuff. And I was fortunate enough to be able to pull 400 women who had experienced pregnancy or infant loss, and it was all anonymous.
yeah.
That was important to me so that everybody could, feel like they could answer honestly. And yeah, that research was just so fascinating, to be able to step back and look at.
Mm,
Um, Probably one of the most, it's not surprising, it was more so just disheartening to hear, is that 84% of lost moms feel some degree of shame
mm,
around their loss.
yeah.
And I knew that that number was going to be high. I didn't think it was going to be 84%. Like, that's an overwhelming majority.
Yeah.
And that just really showed me, um, even though pregnancy and infant loss is being talked about more, we still have so far to go,
Yes.
in terms of a culture that supports and makes space for these types of stories, because so many women are living in shame.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is heartbreaking.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
heartbreaking. And so in bringing that up, what do you think the American church has missed, when it comes to ministering to families, to women who
Mhm.
are feeling this way? Like
Yeah.
they've experienced miscarriage and infant loss, and they feel shame. Like what has the church missed in helping them?
I think, and this is kind of goes along with our culture, our Western culture too, is it's motherhood has been reduced to this kind of box that um, is seen as women with biological children.
Yes.
And any other form of motherhood or any other experience of motherhood is not really given a seat at the table. And I think there are just some simple changes, even in terms of wording, acknowledgement, the way that churches recognize moms on Mother's Day, what they do for Mother's Day. There can be small paradigm shifts that are made, even as much as acknowledging days like Mother's Day, and saying, hey, we recognize that this day may hold pain for a lot of women,
Mhm.
and that the gamut of motherhood experiences is so much bigger than what we typically think of socially still. It encompasses so much more. Um, and so, really, I think there's a great opportunity to help women feel at home in their stories, just by the way that we talk about motherhood from the stage, the way that we recognize Mother's Day, the way that we do women's ministry
Yeah.
and events and things like that. If you're a larger church with resources that is able to have grief specific groups, I attended a grief group at another church that had a group specifically for women who had gone through pregnancy and infant loss, and you could attend with your spouse. Being
Mm,
being
that's
able to
nice.
offer resources like that, or
Yeah.
partner with organizations that do, that helps so much. And just letting women know, okay, this part of my story is welcomed here too.
Yeah.
But I think by and large, and I'm curious about your observation on this too, Natasha, I think the American church doesn't make a lot of space for grief.
Yeah.
And it just feels often like we miss so much of what's expressed in our scriptures, given that I think it's 2/3 of the Psalms are laments.
Yes.
And, the story of Job, it's 35
Mm.
chapters of him
Yeah.
shouting at God.
Yeah.
And just proportionately, the way that we do our corporate gatherings, even if we had 1 to 2 times a year where people could lament publicly and be
Absolutely.
supported by their brothers and sisters in Christ and
Mm.
bring that to the altar, I just
Wow.
wonder what a difference that would make to the way
Yeah.
that we view grief.
Wow. That would be so powerful. I think it would be like a a culture shift because I mean, really, how many people are grieving?
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Like it's mostly everyone is over
Exactly.
something or someone. And to not make space for that in our churches is a missed opportunity to be more
Mhm.
like Jesus.
Mhm.
Wow.
And it's hard, it's
Yeah.
messy, like,
It's hard and
it's
messy.
going
Yeah.
to make for awkward moments,
Right.
and I think it's also important to name that it's
Mhm.
not just a church thing, it's
Yeah.
we don't like, um, necessarily sitting in emotions like that.
Mhm.
And we tend to like things as a culture that are positive and
Yes.
exciting and filled with joy and make you feel good. And so all those other emotions we just kind of stuff to the side and don't
Yeah.
make a lot of space for. So
Yes.
yeah, even just and I know that that is not true of other cultures, which
Yeah.
blows my mind because
Yeah.
that's just so counter to what I mean. This is all I've ever known. I've grown up here in America.
Same. Mhm.
Um, but it also gives me hope that
Mhm.
we'll be able to, even the work that you're doing is
Mhm.
helping to make more space for conversations
Mhm.
around these topics that, like you said, everybody is grieving something to one
Mhm.
extent or another.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. It's it's so much to kind of unpack because it's still surprising that it's still a thing
Mhm.
that's not really expressed. I know even with my personal losses with miscarriage and stillbirth at the time, that was averred 20 years ago. And
Mm.
so it was, can you imagine? It was like no resources and no one talking about anything. And so I spent a lot of that, or spent all that time really just stuffing and hiding that grief until literally a couple of years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, and so I'm grateful for organizations and people who are making more space for this, and I'm grateful for people like you who are giving space and resources for those who have experienced miscarriage and infant loss.
Mm.
So yeah,
Would you say that you've seen a shift in the last 20 years in terms of how people are talking about pregnancy and infant loss?
yes, definitely.
Mm.
Yeah, which is crazy because it can seem so minute, sometimes if like small,
Yeah.
but to come from 20 years ago where I was, where it was like, you don't say anything. Like it was so taboo. Like I never heard anyone talk about anything.
Wow. Yeah, I believe
Like
it.
0, and of course, we didn't have social media, we didn't have social media
Right.
and, internet, I don't know, it was like
Dial up. It
tiny
was
clip.
dial up, I think.
Yeah, tell it. So, yeah, so there's that with, not being able to communicate really outside of your circles and, just the places that you travel, so, you weren't connecting like we're
Mhm.
able to do now. So it's definitely come a long way, but it still has a ways to go.
Mhm.
Yeah. And
Yes.
I wanted to mention because we're going to be both speaking at the gathering.
Yes.
So I thought that was super exciting. And it is an organization for bereaved mothers.
Mhm.
And so,
Yeah, Gathering Hope, is incredible. If you're a lost mom listening and looking for a place to connect with other lost moms, and to have your faith be a key part of that processing, I highly recommend checking out the resources from Gathering Hope.
So yeah, I wanted to throw that in there because again, like during my time, there was no resources, but there are some amazing resources these days. And so I want everyone who is listening to get plugged in. And so I wanted to kind of go back to talk about the book. In chapter 4, you write about the importance of empathy, because I
Mm,
love talking about empathy as
yeah.
well. How can empathy make a difference after a miscarriage or stillbirth?
hmm I'm guilty of like thinking that empathy meant that to do empathy well, that I needed to have somebody's experience in my past too, so I could perfectly relate to
Mm,
it. And I've just realized through reading and learning and seeing the empathy that Jesus displays when he comforts people who are grieving in the scriptures is you don't have to have that person's exact grief or loss experience to be able to empathize with them. And it really is this notion of putting yourself in the shoes of another with the heart of, if you've been through any type of grief before. Now, there are obviously nuances to that and complexities in the different types of grief, but if you can remember that heartbreak, that isolation, that doubt, whatever it is that you were feeling in your grief, and know that to some degree, the person that you're sitting with is also feeling the swirl of all of these emotions and confusion and just disorientation around their loss. Um, and I think the ministry just of presence in those
yes,
moments is
yes.
such a
Hmm.
practical form of empathy.
Yes.
And I was actually talking to Peyton from Gathering Hope about this the other week.
Hmm.
We get so worked up in thinking that we have to have grand gestures
Yeah,
and say all the right things, but it's so much simpler than that.
yeah.
And that just helps me. There are times when I'm hearing about somebody's loss and I'm like, wait, I don't know what to say. I
Mhm.
still catch myself feeling
Me
that way
too, me
sometimes. You're
too.
never gonna feel
That's
completely
right.
prepared.
It's
And
true.
yeah, so I just want to say that because
Mhm.
it's not like you're ever gonna get to a point that feel perfectly equipped to respond.
Right.
But thankfully, empathy doesn't require that. Empathy is just like, I'm gonna sit with you,
Hmm.
much like you talk about. And that's what we see Jesus do. I think
Yes.
about
Mm.
a lot when Lazarus dies, which is one of Jesus's closest friends,
Mhm.
and Jesus goes up and arrives on the scene, and he's met by Lazarus's sisters, who blame him for not being there earlier. If you had been here earlier, he wouldn't have died, which I find so much permission in. Like,
Yeah.
wow, that's how they greet Jesus, and
Yeah.
Jesus doesn't
Oof.
get mad. He doesn't
Yeah.
yell back at them. He doesn't try to defend himself.
Yeah.
He responds by just sitting with them,
Yeah.
weeping with them.
Hmm.
That's his response, is Jesus weeps. And I just imagine him huddled close to them with his arm around them, standing or sitting with them. And that is empathy embodied.
Yeah.
And that goes so far um, with somebody in your life who's grieving.
Hmm. Yeah. So that is kind of the essence of my book. Can you just sit with me? It's inviting those to sit with us without having the answers. We
Mm,
don't need someone to fix us. We don't need opinions and um, but presence. Just letting people realize that their presence just is so underrated. Like
yeah,
presence. And then I think we were kind of you might have mentioned earlier about just sitting. Like I don't, and I think it's our culture
mhm,
because we're just so busy that it feels wrong and awkward to just sit.
totally. Yeah, we want to be solution oriented.
Yes, yeah, and so it's hard, and so we have to learn. I think maybe we kind of quote the scripture sometimes: "Be still and know that I am God." And it's
Mhm.
hard, I think, even for Christ followers or believers, for us to just do that.
It's so hard.
And so, trying to walk that out and on top of trying to sit with someone who is hurting and grieving. So I get that, it can be hard because of how we've let culture come in and influence us. So, as far as the 5 stages of hope again,
Mhm.
because it kind of, we have, well, the 5 stages of grief are out there.
Yeah.
And we know, we don't follow 5 stages of grief. But I love how you've taken this hope, the hope that we have in Jesus, and infused it into this process that we can grieve with hope, but having kind of like a model to kind
Mhm.
of look at, even though, like as you mentioned before, that it may not follow like in a straight line as well. So I want you to kind of go back to those and kind of like as you mention each one, if you
Mhm.
can kind of flesh that out a little bit for us.
Sure. Yeah, one thing I realized as I was processing with a friend a few years ago was there's a lot of talk about the 5 stages of
Yeah.
grief. Uh, there was nothing about, at least when I was looking, about stages of hope or what it
Mhm.
even looks like to be able to
Right.
name your
Yeah.
progression in terms of healing your relationship with
Yeah.
hope. Because when you go through loss, especially an unexpected or traumatic loss, there's like a breach in your relationship with hope. I feel
Yeah,
like, at
that's
least from my
good.
experience, like
Yeah.
it is hard to trust hope again in the same way that you used to. And I think that's just an easy thing to kind of sweep under the rug, and so
That's
many
good.
people struggle with. So, and all that to say, this comes out of just a desire to be able to have language
Mm.
and around hope and what it
Yeah.
looks like to kind of walk that out. So, the 5 stages of hope are expectation, shock, despair, grief, and active hope. And I have correlated all of these with Holy Week. So they find their birthplace in Holy Week. So in expectation, in order to have a breach in your relationship with hope, you have to back it up a few stages to be like, what set up that breach?
Mm.
Um, and I think one of the things that's unique to pregnancy and infant loss is that right before that breach in hope, the majority of women are at a heightened
Yeah.
emotional level because you're filled with some degree of expectation. Even if the pregnancy was a surprise,
Yeah.
you suddenly are like, okay, I have this great expectation. 9 months from now, my life's going to
Yeah.
change. You start making these arrangements, and you're having an elevated emotional experience. So you're up on this peak, sort of, and then right after that is the shock, and it's just like a huge plummet. So you're dropping higher than you normally would have if you were just
Yeah.
like a status quo emotion. And I think that's important to name because that descent is so
Mm.
dramatic, and that is what is so shocking really about
Mm.
pregnancy and infant loss. So then you head into shock, which is the signs that something is wrong. A lot of times there's still an element of disbelief,
Mhm.
maybe even denial, pleading with God that something could be reversed.
Yeah.
That's what we see Jesus doing in the Last Supper here. I mean, in the garden, right after the Last Supper,
Yeah.
is pleading with God that it could go a different way, that this
Mhm.
cup could be taken. The third stage is despair. And that's when the reality of death starts to set in. So I equate that with Good Friday. It's this feeling of God has forsaken me, death has entered into this piece of my story. My prayer wasn't answered the way that I hoped that it would be, and there is despair over that. Then we move into grief, which I think is the longest season in the stages of hope, especially for a lost mom, and that kind of finds its home in Silent Saturday,
Mm.
and it's silent
Mm.
during that grief period.
Mm.
For a lost mom, you're also feeling the silence of perhaps family and friends
Yeah.
not necessarily knowing how to come alongside you, and that's
Mm.
isolating. You could be feeling silence from God.
Mm.
Like, I remember feeling that, like, I am not hearing anything. My prayer life just feels so flat. I don't feel like God's with me anymore. But we're also coming up against the silence of culture around pregnancy and infant
Yeah.
loss. We don't have a lot of the traditional grieving norms, like a funeral, gathering people together, especially if you've had a miscarriage. You
Yeah.
don't. you don't get to have a burial and there's no headstone. Like, you don't have access to those traditional
Yeah.
grieving, like, social norms,
Yeah.
which, although those are short-lived, I still think that they're helpful.
Oh, absolutely.
And so it just feels silent for a
Yeah.
while.
Wow.
And then slowly you start to feel this, I call it active hope, because it's different than hope. It's living in the reality of the hope of the resurrection. And that it doesn't happen overnight. You just kind of start to feel it slowly creep in different ways. Um, for me, it would just be these little inklings. I would have thoughts about the future that would turn into desires about the future,
Mm.
dreams about the future. It can feel scary to dream about the future when you are struggling with hope.
Mm.
So that kind of slowly starts to become active again, that feeling of hope. And for a follower of Jesus, that just changes so much in terms of our story with whatever we've lost. We know that the loss as we know it is not the end,
Mhm.
and that the hope of heaven really does change uh, the way that we view the future with whatever it is that we've lost.
Yes. Oh, gosh. It's just so beautiful. It's so beautiful. I'm sitting here thinking like, okay, I hope our sessions are not like back to back or something because I'm gonna be like, I'm gonna be crying.
Aw, same. We
Oh
will be
my
back to back, I'm sure.
gosh. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. It's so good. It's so good. It's so good. Uh, because, again, I so appreciate your words and your work in this area because it is deep. It's deep and it's deep in the best of ways of just showing the hope of Christ and connecting it with his word so that others can really get it deeper and that there is hope. This thing was horrible.
Mhm,
Like what you experienced is just tremendously horrible, sad, the worst.
mhm.
But somehow there is hope,
Yeah.
So gosh. So I'm just super excited about your book and you're launching it into the world and I just know it's just going to help so many lost moms.
Thank you for your kind words, Natasha.
Yes.
I hope so.
So much so. So I have a few things um before I let you go. um, can you shared a little bit about Hope Again Collective?
Mhm.
Just share where you can those listening can get that, pick up some jewelry.
Yeah, you can come visit me at hopeagaincollective.com. I'm also on Instagram at Hope Again Collective. And I usually release 1 to 2 new collections every month. The styles change out. I love to do kind of seasonally themed collections. And yeah, so there's usually something new on the site or something new coming soon. So I'd love for you to stop by.
Yes, that is so fun, so cool. And then I want to ask, what would you say to anyone listening, a woman who's listening, watching, or reading your book um, that has recently walked through the loss of her baby? Like, what
Mm,
hope can you leave them with?
yeah. If that's you and you're listening, I'll first say, I'm just so sorry for what you're walking through right now. And my greatest encouragement would be to keep your communication open with God, even in the silence, even if you're angry. Maybe you don't even desire to talk to God, to keep that communication open, because that will be your lifeline, what sustains you. And although it may not feel like it now, the wrestling that you do with God in this season of grief, it's going to plant seeds that allow a deeper, more beautiful faith to grow in a season ahead in your life. And you're going to experience hope, real hope, in a different way than you did pre loss. And I say that not to rush you through the season that you're in right now, but just to plant a little seed of hope on the horizon, because I needed somebody to do that for me and
Yeah.
to remind me that it wasn't always going to feel the way that it felt in that moment, in the crux of it, deep pain. So take your time in the season that you're in, but really wrestle it out with God. He's not afraid of what you have to say to him. He's not ashamed. He's not mad at you. He's not going to hold it against you. None of that stuff. You have permission, just like Jesus did on the cross, in his deepest, most painful moment, to say, God, why have you forsaken me? We have permission to do the same.
Yes. Oh, I love that so much. What an encouragement, Rachel. What an encouragement. So, where can everyone who is listening find you, connect with you, purchase your book?
Yeah, I'd love to connect with you. My personal website is rachellohman.com. My Instagram is rachel.lohman. And you can purchase Miscarried Hope on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere that books are sold. And I hope that your hope is encouraged as you read.
Yes. Yay. This has been such an honor and blessing sitting with you, Rachel, and just hearing your heart behind your book. And just wish you so many blessings and everyone who will get to read your book. So thank you for sitting with me.
Thanks so much, Natasha. It's been an honor.
That brings me to the end of this episode. Thanks again for joining me, and thanks for listening to Can You Just Sit With Me? If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and be sure to come back for my next episode of Can You Just Sit With Me? Until then, this is Natasha Smith, helping you to find hope in grief, hope in the hard place, and hope in the challenging times of life. Be sure to connect with me across social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at I'm Natasha Smith.